Right, so who are we?
We are IE Brand and Digital. We're Ollie and Dave. That good enough?
That is a fair summation of the situation. So we're doing a podcast, Ollie. Why on earth are we doing a podcast?
Because we've been in business for 30 years, we feel like we've got some valuable experience to share, and we want to be generous with that.
And who is this for? Who is our dearest listener?
I'd say it's for clients, potential clients, but anybody who is seeking to tell the story of their organisation via either brand or digital routes.
That's absolutely right. And what the plan is, I think, is that every episode we're going to talk about one particular issue related to brand or digital.
Indeed.
And the first one up is messaging. We're going to be talking about messaging. So, what do we mean by messaging?
I think messaging encompasses everything to do with the narrative of your organisation. So it's imagining that you're speaking to a donor, a supporter, a trustee, anybody with an interest in your organisation, and they say to you, who are you, what do you do, and why should I care? Your answer is messaging. But messaging also finds its way into formal channels like websites, social media, printed literature, and other assets of that sort. So it covers a huge range of both written and spoken word. The question I'd love to ask you, though, Dave, is how is copy different from messaging?
Well, I think they're related, but I think anybody listening to this in a Marcom's role probably has worked with a copywriter in the past, but they won't necessarily have done work on key messaging. So I think the difference is that I think copywriting is virtually every piece of writing that you put out to the world. It is your social media channels, your newsletter, the page articles on your website. And all of that is really important. But I think when we use the phrase messaging, we're talking about the fundamentals. So perhaps a metaphor you could use is the difference between an architect and a builder, perhaps. Obviously, you need both in order to move into your house. But we're less talking, I think, about the everyday, the plastering, the painting, all of those really important things that need doing, and more about the fundamentals, the expression of who we are and what we do. And I think that that's where you can have a great copywriter, but if you haven't got a really good sense of who you are and what you're doing, there's only so much they can do with what they're given. So I think we're really, when we're saying messaging, talking about that top level piece.
Great. So you're saying you're more of an architect than a builder, Dave?
I think so, yeah. If you've seen my DIY, that's definitely close to the truth.
Cool. Okay, so what about the big messaging challenges that our clients are coming to us with?
Well, we do, as you know, we work with a lot of clients, and I think most of them, if not all of them, tend to want at least some help with messaging. And I think that often the challenge that they have is summing up everything that they do into a finite number of words. So we talk about a core proposition, sometimes called an elevator pitch. It's that idea that every single organisation, irrespective of what sector it is, what they're doing, what they offer, they need to be able to articulate themselves in a single paragraph, possibly even a single line. And I think that's really tough for some of our clients, especially where they have a diverse and broad service offering. I think they struggle to prioritise, is this thing over here more important than this? And that's where you often find organisations that can describe who they are in, a book, possibly a chapter. If you ask them to do it on a page, they struggle. And frankly, if you want them to do it in a single paragraph, forget it. And I think there's that old adage of the wood for the trees. I think the longer people are immersed in an organisation, the harder they find that to do. And to some degree, we're able to come in with fresh eyes and say, look, to us, actually, this seems to be the really important thing. Why are you not saying this? And, I think we've both had occasions where people have said, they've spent years trying to come up with something that we've been able to, albeit with the client, thrash through in a couple of hours in a workshop. So yeah, that simple articulation of who you are and what you're all about just seems very difficult for clients to do. I don't know what your thoughts would be.
Yeah, I think seeing the wood for the trees is a key challenge for them. I don't think it's necessarily you've been there for years and you can't see that clarity anymore. I spoke to a client this afternoon, initial conversation, very experienced Marcoms professional, just arrived a month ago in a charity, and they know that there's something fundamentally wrong with the messaging of the organisation, but she cannot quite put a finger on it. And when she confronts senior people, they share her sense that things are not quite right, but they think that they might benefit from an external agency popping in and having a good look. I think not least because we bring not only fresh eyes, but eyes that have glanced at literally hundreds of organisations and had to somehow discover their essence and articulate their story in as few words as possible and as compelling language as possible, because that's the combination you want to get. I'm not just wanting to tell you my story or explain myself. I'm actually wanting you to care. But why do you think it is so hard for clients? Because they should be the best placed of all people to articulate their own story. So why is it they struggle so much?
I think there's something about people more than brands that have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to themselves. I think almost, you could imagine it easier to talk up somebody rather than talk about your own virtues to some degree. And I think that's the same organisationally. I know we've had clients who we've had to really encourage to big themselves up, really. That they're always quite apologetic about who they are and say, oh, I don't think we could say that. We've had people that genuinely are the only person in a sector doing a certain thing, but they're very reticent to say they are the leading. And I think that it can be a problem for them.
I think that's something that's really specific to the sector that we work in as well, to some degree. I think that charity, health, education, values-driven organisations sometimes struggle to just tell it straight. We're the best in our sector. We're doing the best work. We're the most innovative. We're the biggest. We're the most impactful. They somehow have this sense that if they say that they are boasting, that they are proud, that they lack the humility that the sector expects of them. And it's a waste, because all those words, all those indicators enable their audiences to locate them relative to all the other people in their sector.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think the other reason it's hard is because I think that often our clients exist in a world where there can be quite a collegiate atmosphere, where there's a sense that you can have divergent arms of an organisation, some of which see the organisation through this lens, some of which have this lens over here. And I think when we're brought in, there can be a reticence to almost say it like it is for fear of upsetting the apple cart. And so I think some organisations, for diplomatic reasons, think it's better to obfuscate in the hope that nobody gets terribly upset. And they underestimate that the effect that has on the outside world is typically confusion.
I completely agree. And I think that pressure which we apply in spade loads to gain simplicity is inevitably sometimes at the expense of complexity. Certainly, possibly even of nuance occasionally. You need to tell a really simple, accessible story, but you've got the option to intrigue with that story. And therefore, that can lead to another question which will allow you to add the nuance, to inject the complexity. But you've got to begin with simplicity, because you've got to assume that the person who's listening to the story doesn't care, hasn't got much time, is listening to dozens of other stories, and just wants a quick taster to know whether they want to plough on and explore a little further.
So let's talk a little bit about process. So I think when you think of a messaging project, I think it's safe to say most reputable brand agencies will do messaging in some way, shape or form. But I think it's safe to say over the years we've put quite a lot of effort into trying to work out what the best way of taking a client on this journey. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how we do messaging.
Yeah, so it tends to start, as all projects do, with something like a kick-off meeting where we're just sort of trying to relay the ground rules, meet the key people, etc. We then jump pretty quickly into immersion. So immersion is us just trying to, as it sounds, get thoroughly soaked in the organisation, gain a really rich sense of who they are. And we do that in a couple of ways. We invite people to upload resources. So those are examples of how we have articulated our story in the past. They might be impact reports or websites, URLs or social feeds or anything of that sort. But we also want to hear the spoken word, how they articulate their story to one another in the context of, I don't know, a meeting with friends when a friend asks, who are you and what it is that you do, what it is that the organisation you work for does. So we run that via a workshop, and a messaging workshop tends to just ask a whole bunch of questions to the client and gives them an opportunity to rehearse telling that story in different contexts to different people. After the immersion workshop, we have effectively collected sufficient ingredients for us to bake something interesting. So we've got not the actual words that we're going to use or the precise articulation and explanations, but we've got loads of really valuable understanding of the organisation and ingredients that we may or may not want to deploy in the final messaging matrix, as we call it. We then go away and we separate ourselves off from the client, and we have a chunk of time where we simply write, and typically, Dave, this is you, isn't it? Writing in seclusion, having a first draft, getting rid of that blank sheet. So a first draft of the messaging matrix is written, and then after that, that's thrown over to the client, and it bats back and forth through multiple iterations as we perfect the articulation of the messaging that we've kicked off. And eventually everybody agrees that they're happy with it. It then settles down into a finished, signed-off version and then gets deployed in the real world.
Is it worth talking about why we have this kind of one-page? Why do we like a matrix rather than a written style guide, 20, 30 pages?
Yeah, I think our experience has been, bitter experience, is that if you write the 20, 30-page document, frankly, it either gets filed in a filing cabinet or digitally ends up somewhere in the dark recess of somebody's hard drive, and it never sees the light of day. Whereas if I can give you a single page that you can literally put up where you sit in front of your face, so that when you next have to tell the story of your organisation to a particular audience, you have immediate visual reference to call upon, then you're much, much more likely to actually use the thing. And the beautiful thing is when we go and visit a client 5, 6, 7 years after we've done their messaging matrix, you walk into the room where the Marcoms professionals are sitting and you'll see a couple of messaging matrices still sitting there. It may have evolved a little bit, as any story should, but it's still there and it's still a valuable reference point. So Dave, I mentioned ingredients earlier. What are, in your view, the key or essential ingredients for a good messaging matrix?
Well, we thought long and hard about this, haven't we? I think that no two client has quite the same output, not just in terms of content, but sometimes we will feel quite strongly that we need to approach it in a slightly different way. But I think things that are always there, I would say the core proposition.
Why is it a value proposition?
Well, it's a value proposition because effectively it comes back to that why should I care? It is really about in as few words as possible, and as succinctly describing, this is the value that I can offer you. This is what we exist to do. I often say it's the who we are, what we do, perhaps how we do it, and why I should care. And that's all you're trying to get in there. It's so important because I think, when you think of your website, for instance, as your core Marcoms tool, I always encourage our clients to have the proposition on the homepage, if not above the fold on the homepage, because when you're visiting a website, really what you're doing is trying to filter in or out whether it is worth your time being on here. I've come with an ask, I've come with a need. I need to either be disavowed of that or think, yeah, that's it, as soon as possible. And it is remarkable how many client websites we trawl through where you could have spent half an hour of reading through different pages and still not really being sure who they are and what they do. So that's, I think, always taking pride of place on the matrix. I think tone of voice, maybe we'll talk about tone of voice in a minute so it doesn't hijack this question, but that's really the personality you infuse the messaging with. Call to action, I think, is really important. And it's remarkable how you can read some examples of comms from clients like newsletters, like emails, like leaflets, where there isn't a clear sense of actually what you want the person to do. And, I'm a big believer that unless there's a call to action, and it doesn't matter what the call to action is, it can be sign up for this or contact us, or donate. It's a waste of time. If the person can simply put down the item that they're reading and do nothing, you've got to ask yourself why you created that in the first place. And then I think what we always try and do is we segment audiences. So the matrix is divided into kind of horizontal rows, but also vertical columns. And that's simply in recognition that clearly if you have diverse audiences, you're going to want to speak to people differently. If you have a beneficiary, the messages that you're going to be communicating to them are going to be inherently different to a funder. So that's towards the bottom of the matrix where we start saying, okay, well, these are the key messages, but how do they need to morph and adapt depending on who we're talking to?
So would you say the core value proposition speaks to everybody, ideally?
I think it has to, because almost if somebody's landing on your website, you can't decide what their user journey is at that stage. You don't know who they are. So there has to be almost a universal theme. And you can have sub-propositions. We do that sometimes, whereby almost as soon as you're aware of who the user is, then there's suddenly almost a separate statement. This is the value proposition, not just for the organisation holistically, but for you as an individual. Now we know who you are.
And is that not a dishonest thing? You're saying that the story changes depending on who I'm talking to.
I think that we all do this in our everyday lives all the time. We often love that metaphor of brand as a person. So, you are speaking to me as, work Dave, and I'll go home and speak to my wife and my children in different ways to my friends. But I think I'm still communicating the same essence of who I am. I'm just modifying it a little bit depending on what I think the audience wants to hear. So I think certainly if you were to scatter those different expressions of self on a table, they should all fit comfortably, and if almost you would be embarrassed to show audience A, audience E's messages, you've probably been a little bit dishonest. However, if you were to say, look, it doesn't matter if audience A sees audience E's, it just won't resonate as much. I think that's good segmentation.
That's really helpful. What about the difference between writing for profit-generating companies and non-profits?
That's an interesting one. I think there are nuances. I think profit versus non-profit, values-driven versus commercial is almost one aspect of the conundrum. Another one that has to be held alongside it, I would say, is almost services versus product-based organisations. And typically, I think values-driven organisations are often service industries. And I think a specific challenge that service-based organisations have, and this includes values-driven organisations, is making what they offer tangible. So I think that certainly if, in my dim and distant past in agency life, I've been commissioned by a blue chip or by a big corporate, often they'll have a product to sell. So that makes the importance of messaging less acute. I think almost a metaphor I might give is if you go on holiday and you go somewhere where you can't speak the language, if you walk into somewhere and you want the third slice of pizza on the right, you can almost just gesticulate and say, I want that. You can hand your money on the till, you can walk away with it. That sense of, I give money and there's something tangible in return, means that messaging is only ever going to be a layer on top of that. It's about saying, we're selling you the best product. When you are a service-based organisation, often the very thing you offer is only words, really. It's the feeling. If you're going to support a charity, for instance, really, why are you supporting the charity? You are supporting them because you believe in them. And the only way you can believe in them is really based on what they tell you. The feel-good factor of having aligned values, and in return for your kind donation, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Unlike the product, that's almost impossible to do without words. So what I'm saying is that it's really high stakes, because frankly, if you're saying donate to me and you cannot in words describe why it is important for you to do that, you're lost. There's nothing to fall back on. There's nothing else you give other than that exchange of, let me tell you a story of how your hard-earned money can really transform us. So I think that's the difference. It's the stakes, because you can't fall back on it's a good car even if there is no messaging.
That's really clear. Love that.
So I think that's why I think it's really important to get messaging right. I mean, what would you add to that?
The only thing I would add is the difference between features and benefits. And I think that regardless of whether it's product or service, people fall into the temptation to list features where actually what people want to hear is what is the ultimate benefit going to be. So if it's a product, again, listing all those micro features is frankly boring. Something that's going to transform my life, something that's going to improve my relationships. I mean, taking the relationship example, say you are a relationship charity and you help people stay in close relationship, or you help them through difficult encounters with people that they're close to. You can talk about the fact that you do psychotherapy, transactional therapy, CBT, and so the list can go on and on and on. Or you can tell them, do you want to feel closer to your nearest and dearest? Yeah. Do you want help in having those difficult conversations as you separate? Yeah. Do you want to have a last-ditch attempt to save your relationship? Those are genuine benefits. Those are things that emotionally we can connect to and get excited about. And the features can come further down the line. The helpline runs 9 to 5 weekdays only. Yeah. Frankly, don't care. I want to know what you've got for me of value that can give me hope, that can bring me joy, that I can pass on to those people I really love and care about. And I think it's the same. You gave the example of making a donation. I haven't got a product. In fact, ironically, after I've made a donation, I've got less of something than I had when I first started the conversation. What you've given back to me, hopefully, is a sense of my significance in the work that we jointly, charity and donor, are involved in, and the transformation to another life, a life that may be thousands of miles away and wildly different to my own, but somehow by making that donation, I am intimately connecting myself to that beneficiary. Yeah, and that's what great messaging, I think, can do.
Great point.
So what about the nitty-gritty, Dave? Your writing process. What does that look like? You've gained all the ingredients you need in your immersion workshop, and then you go away and the door closes behind you in your office. What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is always, I think every writer does it a little bit differently. I think I would pick up on what you said earlier, which is that the kind of kill the white space. I think nothing is as paralyzing as the blinking cursor. And I think I don't worry terribly about getting it in a great shape first time around. Almost without sounding too pretentious, I almost try and be quite impressionistic about it. That sense of, fill the canvas and then slowly start adding the detail, and that's what I do. So I'll write with lots of X, Y, Zs, for instance, because sometimes I'll think the opening has come to me really quickly. This thorny middle bit I'm not sure about, so I'll just leave that, because what I want to do is kind of get into the flow. I tend to think quite melodically. It's almost a bit like songwriting to me. I tend to think, especially a proposition, it has a tune, and I think that you want it to have the kind of triumphant end. So often I'll be thinking not just the words, but almost I want the cadence of bop, ba da bop, 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 and that's often where I'll agonise over words, because I'll think, although factually that's right, it's not following that tone. So I read out aloud a lot. And in fact, you'll know, we often present clients by reading some of the messaging out aloud, so that there's almost a bit of a universal experience when they all hear it for the first time. And I think then what I tend to do is go in and add the detail, and stress test it as much as I possibly can. And then typically we will pass our messaging back and forth. Internally, yes. So I think that you are a very good editor, I would say, in terms of challenging me on certain things that I've thrown in there, improvements. I think we both know our different writing styles, and I think sometimes we'll think, oh, Ollie will be great at that kind of short form, pithy campaign language. For instance, I tend to handle the kind of longer narrative type prose. And we go back and forth until we think it's worth throwing the doors open and bringing the client in. But I think we always try to be bold and brave in terms of pushing the client a little bit. So I think sometimes we'll think, I'm not sure if they'll go for that, but they're paying us to advise them. So, I'm a big believer, go bold, and if it has to be a little bit more conservative with a small c, so be it. Whereas I think if you go too safe, it's very hard to tweak it up, to punch it up.
And I think clients are inviting us in to disrupt. If it was an easy solution, or if it was close to what they've already been doing, frankly, they can make that iterative step. What they want is a leap forwards. And I think that's something you're unusually good at, to be honest. Sure, listening to the client and understanding their explanation of the audience, but also being bold enough to drive forward with a new solution and a new articulation that genuinely sounds quite distinctly different.
I think certainly we try not to start writing too quickly in the process, because I'm a big believer that it's hard to kind of put a finger on when this happens, but often because we'll have started the project with a research phase and an immersion phase, sometimes we could have been working with a client for weeks, if not months, by the time we come to messaging. And that's really important, because I think there's always a critical moment, and sometimes it's you're on a presentation, or you might be hearing the result of the research, and something clicks and you just think, that's them. Sometimes we both just asterisk, don't we, and write a really simple couple of words, and as soon as you think, that's them, it makes it a lot easier, because you're suddenly able to think, oh, well, now I know that. How does this need to read? I certainly wouldn't want to do messaging first in the process, because you'd have so many questions about the organisation. It would be next to impossible, to do, I think.
Yeah. So that penny dropping, that aha sort of revelatory, suddenly it makes sense to me moment. And that, as you say, tends to happen in conversations. So it's actually really difficult if an organisation were just to send us a bunch of resources and say, look at how we talk, please improve it. We wouldn't do that piece of work.
Or it would be copywriting, wouldn't it? And that's what copywriters do. And we, it's retelling of the existing. It is. But it's a bit like, analog technology. If you did one duplicate of a VHS, the next one would be poorer quality, and the next one, I think that can happen with copywriting, because it's so far removed from when you actually were trying to say a certain message. All you've got is ChatGPT type regurgitation of words. but I think the penny dropping is the right phrase. And sometimes I think the penny drops in a way that the client might have expected and is really comfortable with. And sometimes the penny drops in a way that's quite surprising to the client. Like, really? Is that how you see us? And that's when it can be more of a battle. But, it's an interesting part of the process that you're on, really. You have to be open to completely changing the way an organisation communicates. And that's actually why, to some degree, I try and keep myself away from the existing messaging. So by the time I start writing, it's really important I know a lot about this organisation, but what I wouldn't do is copy and paste the old proposition and start seeing how I can reuse that. I want a totally fresh approach, and then at the end I might say, oh, actually, I quite like that line in the old, we'll bring it back. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about tone of voice? What is it, and how do you find a client's unique tone of voice?
Yeah, well, that is a good question. I would say that once you have a better sense of organisationally what we want to communicate, I think suddenly you start to have the bare bones of what the messaging needs to do. And then where tone of voice is concerned is where you start to think, well, I have the choice of which words to use and in which way, and almost how I can use language in a way that is distinctive or memorable to a particular client. So our experience is that when you use the metaphor of brand as a person, most people have a distinctive personality and tone of voice. If you meet them, you can go back home to your partners or your friends and say, I met this really interesting person today, they were X, Y, and Z. And that personality doesn't need to be virtuous. You can have an absolutely, appalling personality, but you would still be distinct and memorable in that respect. Organisationally, it's harder because I don't think every organisation is gifted a tone of voice. Quite the opposite. I think some organisations, either by desire or accidentally, homogenise to such a degree that it is impossible to derive any personality from what they've written.
Right, so they become professional, but they become bland and unrecognisable and inseparable from competitors and comparators.
It's ditch water if you're not careful. And I think to some degree that word professional you used is part of the problem. I think at some point somebody, preached that, a professional brand is almost the zenith of where we're all trying to go. We would see that as a hygiene factor. It's like everybody, should be professional, thank you very much. But that by itself is kind of irrelevant. And I think that in the brand space, you have seen certainly, the rise of brands trying to outcompete one another in terms of brand personality and tone, being kind of wackier and more zany than the next in order to kind of build market share and be distinct. So I think when we're thinking of tone of voice, we want a tone that's distinctive. We want it to be authentic, though. So what we don't want to come in and say is, look, it's dull at the moment, but in the bottom of our suitcase, we've got a great personality you're going to love. So henceforth, you are this. And that's probably one of the fears our clients have, which is why they've not done this in the first place. What we actually want to do, we talk about removing the masks. So some people think that brand agencies are there to put a mask on. We often say, actually, it's about taking the mask off and being your true, authentic self. And so the key to a tone of voice for us is always the people. So we have worked with some brands where if you were to visit their website or read their annual report, it is kind of cringe-worthily indistinct. However, you can have a great workshop with the people that run the organisation, almost that those people are imbued with really rich personalities. It's just never made its way into the comms. So that's the first thing that we do, is we say, look, frankly, that call I've just had for 45 minutes, if that is the impression somebody got from reading your website, then that's it, job done. And although there are different people in an organisation, you do find that like attracts like, don't you? We whether it's kind of top down or bottom up, there's a sense that people will join an organisation because it feels like it's kind of their kind of place. So again, the first step in the process is to understand, forget all the messaging, what's the authentic tone of the organisation, and then really we write it like that. So if they've got an incredible chief exec, suddenly the comms are going to sound a bit more like the chief exec, or the charismatic marketing person, or the head of digital. Because what we're really trying to say is it's all well and good the organisation growing because you as an individual are wonderful, but actually the organisation needs to be communicating that when you're not in the room. When you're sleeping, actually the comms are doing the job, and that's where the tone of voice and personality comes in. So I would say, how do we make them distinct? Well, really the only way two of our clients would sound similar is really if organisationally they are similar, if that makes sense. In terms of personality. And I think that wouldn't be necessarily a problem unless perhaps your main competitor was like-minded. So I think a good example would be higher education, where you do have hundreds of different universities. And in that instance, I think we're less interested in the personality of the people working at the university, more interested in the type of person that would go to that university. So, often a student will float around different universities when they're looking and say, I'm going to this open day. I'm trying to find my tribe, my people, and eventually they'll go to one and they'll go, yeah, that's the one I want to go to, because just like me, these people are X, Y, and Z, and that could be the key to your tone of voice and personality. It would certainly be the key to connecting and engaging with that student audience, if that's one of the things that you would want to be doing with messaging, which, it almost certainly would be.
Great. What about storytelling? How important is storytelling as a slither, if you like, a slice of the whole messaging picture?
Well, I think it's really vital, really, because I think there is definitely a sense that storytelling and narrative, I think, is hardwired into us as humans. I think that stories seem to have existed as long as humans have roamed the earth. There seems to be something powerful about narrative, beginning, middle, and end. Whether that's a fable through to a film. So I think that certainly if you can tell stories through the lens of your messaging, I think that is going to be much more powerful. And I think that's an easy kind of narrative device to use to think about, okay, if I'm telling the history of the organisation, have we told the beginnings of where we've come from? Have we said where we are now? And have we told people where we're going? The other way that we use storytelling is to kind of bring to life the emotional dimension of messaging. One of the great things, one of the privileges of working with non-profits and often charities is you can hear these wonderful stories or powerful stories or heartbreaking stories. And it's surprising how little often our clients leverage that. And that is something that, let's say, kind of more soulless, product-based business could only dream of having that emotional resonance. And we have had organisations kind of well up when they're hearing our messaging, even though all we've done is repackaged their stories. But yeah, I would say that we're always effectively scouring an organisation for its stories. We will say to people, I want you to give us some anecdotes, tell us about some impact, tell us about some donors, some beneficiaries, some of the lives transformed by the work that you do. And then we will use every word and every nuance to punch that up to make it really hit you, because that's where engagement's born, And if you've only got 8 seconds on a scrolling newsfeed when you're doom scrolling, it is going to be that one sentence that just catches your eye and says, oh, actually, in those 3, 4, 5 words, you've told a story, and it's one I want to hear more about. So
And why is it? Why is it that organisations who really genuinely want to make a difference are sometimes reluctant to trade on stories, to use stories as a valuable currency?
Well, I think there's probably two reasons. I wonder if sometimes it is an inability to become a storyteller. I think there is perhaps an art in telling a good story. You know, you see this on a TED Talk, don't you, for instance? You know, you can listen to somebody that speaks for 45 minutes and it's vaguely interesting, but it didn't quite hold your interest. And then a storyteller will come on. And actually, even though they're not saying anything hugely different, they've just wound it into a narrative. You know, they open the talk with this and then they keep coming back to it. Comedians do the same thing. You know, it's that kind of packaging all the jokes into one big payoff at the end. So I think that perhaps there might be a skills gap, and some clients almost can see a good story, but they don't know how to get there. And perhaps I think sometimes clients overestimate the levels of interest and motivation that their readers will have. So I think often our clients might think, well, the story's there. You know, all they've got to do is read 30 pages and 12 case studies and they'll get it. And actually, to some degree, we're saying that they're never going to do that, frankly. So either you can compress it and tell it in a short, pithy story, or you can't. A motivated reader might be somebody that needs to read this thing, therefore they will invest the time. But frankly, most readers will not fall into that category.
Yeah, because I think we see extremes with storytelling as well. We see some Marcoms professionals who just are utterly and unreservedly committed to protecting the identity and the privacy of beneficiaries. Yeah. And therefore they just don't believe they can tell any story. And then you've got other people who are almost over-telling stories. So they want to impart vast amounts of context and information. And actually the sweet spot is somewhere in between, where we don't need to compromise privacy, but we can tell a succinct, compelling story, beginning, middle and end, with a relatively few words, and leave people with a real sense of the transformational arc of an organisation. This is the difference we can make in the form of a real person, their experience.
Well, absolutely right. And that kind of reminds me of the sense that how often do we have clients that have accidentally written themselves out of the story entirely? So they will tell you a story of somebody in trouble and the happy ending. It's a great story in of itself, but they're not in the story, you know, and that's something we have to do. Look, you know, don't tell the story unless you're telling it through the lens of what you did. And, you know, obviously you have to be mindful of, you know, perhaps you worked with partners and perhaps there was a sense of, you know, some work on the part of the beneficiary as well. So you don't need to be the protagonist, but you do need to be a character.
Yeah. Interesting where you place the spotlight. I think that's really interesting.
I think something we often talk about is stats and stories, don't we? You know, do you want to talk a little bit about the role good old-fashioned data and hard statistics plays and how that coexists really with stories?
Yeah, I think that just we have different characters and different types of brains. Some people are really switched on by the hard data, by the impact statistics, and some people want the softer stories. And some people, frankly, want both. And at different times, we want different approaches. So I think that these are entirely complementary. I don't think they are mutually exclusive. I think that you can tell me the story of one compelling individual and the transformation that goes on in their life or the struggles that they are going through. It doesn't even need to be a happy ending. And the way that your organisation has walked with them and accompanied them through those struggles. And you can also tell me the big picture story that maybe is we have engaged with X number of people this year. We have managed to distribute funds of X £100,000 this year. So I do think that both can be used and that they're entirely complementary and that we shouldn't fear either. Some charities, I think, and not-for-profits sometimes worry about statistics, that they are reductive somehow. So you've reduced me to a number of people that we've reached, a number of engagements, a number of changed lives, etc. But I think that we shouldn't fear statistics. We should embrace them, and we should tell stories through them and with them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think especially for me, my kind of right side brain thinks definitely in terms of stories, not statistics. But I'm really grateful for statistics because I think what they do is they underpin the messaging, the story with credibility. In terms of if you're writing fiction, you talk about suspension of disbelief. It's almost that idea that, you can do fantasy, you can do sci-fi, but there has to be some rules. Otherwise, people just find it too ridiculous. They can't buy into it. And I think the equivalent in messaging is almost if you're telling a story and it just feels so fanciful and so abstract that the reader is questioning it and thinking, it can't be true, that's not going to work. It almost doesn't matter how good the story is. And that's where the stats can be really useful because it almost says what you're about to hear in terms of a story can be trusted because it's being grounded in this reality. Otherwise, it's that friend we've all got where the stories are quite tall and you kind of start thinking, well, it's a good yarn, but did that really happen? And almost once that happens, it spoils the illusion. So, yeah, I think the stats ground it and let you really then push the stories as far as they can go for me.
It reminds me of a conversation that we had this morning with a client, and we were trying to get a sense of the scale of the organisation and the difference that they're able to make. So they're working in the criminal justice system, particularly with a focus around women and girls. And somehow in the course of the conversation, they mentioned that they had distributed £30 million in the last 15 years. So they had given that money to research and projects that were helping to change the outcome of women and girls. So that doesn't give me the emotional context of individual women or girls. But what it does do is it immediately gives me a really rich sense of the scale of this organisation. Should I bother to apply for funding to them? Absolutely, I'd be an idiot not to. I need to take them really seriously. They are clearly deeply committed, and therefore they are an organisation of interest to me if I'm operating in that space. So a great example adds nothing to the story, but really gives me a sense of scale and scope.
I suppose, again, the metaphor, if you go to a job interview, you need to have, some grades. You need to have some exams to fall back on. But also, that's only going to take you so far because you need to stand out as an interesting person, full of ideas and full of character. And those two should ideally, work together. Ultimately.
What about writing myths? What are the sort of writing myths that we come up against?
Well, I think we've touched on a few, haven't we? Just in terms of, I think sometimes what clients come into the process thinking is perhaps a limitation when perhaps it's not. I would say a barrier we come up against sometimes can be what I would call quite arbitrary or outdated rules of language and grammar. So you'll often get people say, oh, you don't start a sentence with a conjunction, or, that's not a complete sentence. You can't use a full stop there. If you write with those constraints, there's only so far you can do in terms of imbuing the writing with character. So there are some faux pas of, your spelling and grammar always has to be beyond reproach. But actually a lot of the rules many of us were taught, decades ago are actually what you would call style guidance. They are a product of their time. A good example, there are still people that will put two spaces after a full stop. And that goes back to the time of kind of monospaced typewriters where it would be impossible otherwise to see the return. It has no place at all with variable fonts on modern computers, yet it's hardwired into some people so they continue doing it. So most clients can usually see past that, but sometimes we will present clients with, in our opinion, really great messaging, and sometimes you will get a kind of red-penned version back which is almost stripping it of all the interesting language. And again, Brandon's a person, if you ever transcribe interviews with people, it's so interesting to see how they write. It's why people who write fiction sometimes do really crummy dialogue in novels or in scripts, because they speak as you would write, rather than... I do the opposite, actually. Going back to process, I always tend to write as though you would speak. And sometimes I've even gone as far as to give guidance in the document saying, look, read it out aloud, because frankly, if it's a bit awkward and a bit jargony to say, it's going to be a bit awkward and a bit jargony to read. So almost flipping that on its head.
That goes back to what you were saying earlier about things like rhythm and cadence and melody and actually a sense of musicality. Speech is sound, isn't it? And it needs to sound attractive and engaging and high energy. And yeah.
I mean, you might occasionally, once in 10 years, have an email from an irate, grammar officer. But realistically, very few charities, if ever, have ever lost a donor because, they used a conjunction in the sentence. Although I do remember once a client taking umbrage with you say something like, hello, John, or John Hi, or something in the meeting. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I have a popular start to emails, which is the first name of the person and then dash hi. And he deemed that was disrespectful.
Yeah, and they couldn't work with. So maybe these people are out there, folks. But I don't think we need to spend an awful lot of time worrying about them. Can you think of any other, not just in terms of myths, but in terms of occasions where we struggle to get messaging over the line, or at least the messaging as we like it or want it to be across the line?
Yeah, you touched on the fact that we try to be challenging, so we're going to up the volume and intensity. There's sometimes the challenge that language can bring. And I think sometimes clients struggle with that. I also think that the whole process of sometimes there's a temptation to go out and test language with multiple audiences. And I think high-level testing can be really valuable. Are you getting the message? Is it hitting home? But actually asking people to feedback on the exact words, the more people you ask, you've mentioned this before, you'll find that it's death by 1,000 cuts, and it's just robbing the language of personality. And it will actually just end up going back to the tone that they've lived with for the last 15, 20 years. Exactly. So I think that can be an issue. Just constant iteration and fussing over the language instead of actually just embracing the fact that it gives you a bit of a jangle. And that can be a good thing because it's woken you up, it's challenged you, it's refreshed you, energized you, invigorated you. That's great messaging. Absolutely. So, Dave, you sometimes use the analogy of a taxi driver. So tell me about your taxi driver test.
Well, the taxi driver test is about, that kind of universal experience we all have when we've been for a meeting or something, hopped in a cab and... the taxi driver will say, why are you in the area? And you'll say, I'm visiting a client. Or what do you do? Oh, I work for organisation X. Or what do they do? And I love the sense that an organisation should be able to answer that. You could say the same for, a child or a lay audience, effectively, is what we're saying. And that's really about kind of where you pitch the kind of reading age. So, the statistics on this are balmy. The reading age, the average reading age in the UK, and global statistics are very similar, are a lot younger than most people would expect. And I think a lot of our audiences often like to obfuscate their messaging in this kind of pseudo-academic speak, especially true, frankly, of our universities. And what we're really trying to say is, look, we're not saying write your dissertations or your white papers or your government reports like this. The messaging matrix isn't there to affect how you would write the outputs of an inquiry. what we're saying is this is your marketing messaging, but I think the two get conflated. And so often I'll say that, that's lovely, the explanation you've given, but you've pitched that at a postgraduate level. Bring it down so that the average person can understand, because there's a great fallacy, because frankly, let's imagine there is this learned person with an IQ off the chart. Well, frankly, they're still time poor. They want it as simply as they possibly can. And I think there is nothing to be gained from excluding audiences. So I think the more universal you can make it, frankly, anybody, there has to be a line, we do X, Y, and Z. It can be like pulling teeth trying to get organisations. We'll often hear this immortal line, which is, you've probably never worked with an organisation quite as complicated as us. And first of all, that's nonsense more often than not. They're not often as complicated as they perhaps feel themselves to be. But frankly, even if they are incredibly complex, that's not a good enough excuse. You have to make yourself understandable. You have to simplify the content accordingly. And that's the taxi driver test, really. So, certainly in terms of the proposition, I would always try and keep really simple. I like the idea that people can choose complexity at their own leisure. So, again, if I hit a website, I want the top-level information to be fairly simple to understand. And then, frankly, if I keep going through the levels of the organisation, seeking out more information, it is right and proper that the more information I seek out will be at a greater intensity, depth, volume, simply of number of words, because I've requested it. But what you don't want to do is land on a website and suddenly somebody's giving you a 300-page tome that is completely impenetrable.
And I think that driving question, how simple can we make it,
Yes.
is a really good one to have in the background of your mind as you try and tell the story of any organisation. Because frankly, nobody's left a website or a convention or an office because it was too easy to understand.
Yeah, I think there is a great art in simplifying. And frankly, I think a lot of organisations don't do it because it's really difficult. Often, a lot of the time in the darkened room thrashing out the messaging is rewriting sentences every time, trying to say, it's too long, it's too complex. And that can be quite painful. It's easy to fall back on, we'll just put 3 paragraphs in, that'll keep everyone happy. It's not the right answer, but it's easy, it's seductive to do so.
I think it's really interesting what you said about complexity being revealed as well, if people want it. So you think of all the best teachers that have ever taught you. They are the ones who gave you enough information to sort of broaden your mind, give you a sense of understanding and confidence, from which then they were able to say, you know what I taught you about particle physics last year? Well, let me just tell you another dimension. Yeah, it gets more complicated, it gets more rich, it gets more nuanced. And that's then an adventure. That's the next step in the journey. And I think that getting the first step right is what that core value proposition is all about. It needs to be invitational, it needs to be compelling, it needs to be simple, and it probably needs to be intriguing to whet my appetite to explore further.
Absolutely, yeah. I think almost our ignorance going into a project is a great advantage to us. How often have we been working for very esteemed clients, often sat in a room, I can't speak for you, I can speak for myself, surrounded by people of probably far superior intellect to my own, certainly with a far superior understanding of the mechanics of what they're doing, yet almost not having to have the weight of all of that knowledge and experience is the very way in. It's the kind of, look, am I being stupid, but I don't quite understand? Say it to me, in a way that I can understand. I've got it now. You're using the ignorance of the subject matter to your benefit. It often almost, I think you can, I talked earlier about the idea of not doing messaging too early in a project. The counter argument is don't do it too late, because once we're so immersed in an organisation, almost we'll second guess the simplicity of it because we've sat there too long. You become like effectively a member of their own team. So there's a sweet spot there, I would say.
What about a good copywriter? What is it that a good copywriter can bring?
Well, I think a good copywriter can do a really great job of embodying the brand that you've just crafted. And sometimes, well, in fact, in most cases, I would say, while we tend to do the key messaging in-house, we often like to use copywriters to actually then write an entire website, 300 pages, based on the key messaging that we've supposed. Being a copywriter is the art of being a chameleon. It's about working for a different organisation on the Monday and the Tuesday and the Wednesday, and somehow, like the method acting, embodying, okay, today I use words like this, yesterday I did it differently. You see this with newspaper journalists classically, often all the major news houses would have different style guides. You have to use language slightly differently. But I think a great copywriter can just bring that blueprint to life. It's going back to the builder analogy, isn't it, really? The architecture plans are pointless if the builder deviates from the plans or just does a really poor job of bringing them to life. The house will still fall down, even though, the weights had been calculated in the beginning. And we work with great copywriters, and often we will choose a writer because we know they do that type of brand really well. So if it's got a lot of humour, witty, not every copywriter can do that. It's funny, it's something clients often will worry about in terms of, because not every one of our organisations are using external copywriters. Sometimes it will fall to the marketing person. They might have a very small team, and they will say, what, we love the Matrix, we love your witty messages, but actually we're struggling to replicate them. And so we can handle that in different ways. Sometimes we'll just say, look, we will give you 3 years worth of witty messages for your social media. That's one way of doing it. Sometimes we can do training and we can say, look, this is the difference between a message that it falls flat or it's an awkward joke and nobody likes an awkward joke. This one will have people rolling around in fits. Or the third person is to get just people that are good at that kind of writing. Again, if you're working in the kind of medical sciences or academia, it's good to use copywriters that are very well versed in that, albeit they can plug yours in. But really, we are writing the messaging for copywriters, really. We're effectively trying on this sheet to say, give this to your copywriter, and in the time it takes them to read the document, they should be able to trot out on-brand copy based on this messaging framework. To some degree, that's its entire reason for being.
So, Dave, there can't be loads of people doing this type of work. Tell us your journey into the process of becoming a messaging writer.
So, 20-odd years ago, I trained to be a designer, but I'd always enjoyed writing. I'd always been fairly good at it. And I started noticing that one of the skills a designer needs is the ability to manipulate copy. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. So sometimes, especially in the days of print, not so much in digital, you had a finite amount of words and they needed to fit in a certain space. And I started to notice that if only the client's words could be slightly changed a little bit, it would make for a better advert, more powerful, it would fit better. So I started to send messages to clients saying, would you mind terribly, I've dropped 3 words from your headline, is that a problem? And then I would go a bit further and would say, I really felt terribly pleased with this campaign advert, but the copy's a bit naff. I think it's letting it down a bit. So I would say to the client, look, I've tweaked this a little bit. Do you have a problem? And I was really surprised because I thought that people would react with abhorrence. But typically, and this has been my observation throughout my career, is that people are all too happy to get help on messaging. It became obvious that that was something people really struggled with. So I then started as a copywriter, And then as we moved into, I moved to IE as a brand agency, we have, I think, probably spent the last 10 years honing our messaging process, which has really just been based around what could we do with messaging that would be of the maximum value to our clients. And I think we must, with the Matrix, be getting that fairly right, because I think it's true to say that of our brand deliverables, in other words, the things that our clients commission from us, that's one that very few people choose not to. It's almost like as soon as you flash that up in a client meeting, the lights everyone writes down, we need a messaging matrix. So, I think that's... but I do think the intersection of design and writing, there must be something in that, because I think, you're a good writer yourself and also a designer by background. So I don't think it's true to say every designer is a good writer or every writer is a designer. But I think that there is an overlap almost, because I think you're talking about communication, aren't you, really? And I think certainly they're two sides of the same coin, how I communicate visually and actually how I communicate in the written word. There's a lot of overlap there, I think.
I think keeping that under one roof as well, because I think you're probably being quite flattering there to designers, because I think there's actually very few designers who are good at writing as well. And I think that's why they end up working for a brand agency, where actually both sides of those coins are equally valued. So they stick around and make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think of, the classic kind of heyday of the 80s ad copy, I think that, you see less of that these days, but certainly that old agency world was based around the kind of ad king, strapline, tagline, lead line, and then but how could this be beautiful through that iconic photograph that's going to go with the kind of just do it, to bring the whole.
You've mentioned taglines, straplines. How do those fit within messaging, and also how do they relate to an organisation's name?
Well, it's all messaging. I think that's the point. We see them almost as indistinguishable from one another. So on our matrix, you would see the name, you would see the strapline if there is one, and you would see the proposition. And we would almost think of it in those kind of levels. So we would say your name is the first level of messaging, the strapline is the second, and probably the proposition is the third. And they're interrelated in so much as I would say that if the name is really descriptive, then that takes some of the pressure off the lower levels, because the strapline doesn't need to say what it is, what it does, because the name's done that. If the name's really abstract, then almost that's entirely useless as a messaging device. And it's going to be the strapline or the proposition where the understanding of what you're offering kicks in. I think you're always trying to avoid duplicating words, so you don't want the same kind of couplet of words to appear in the name, strapline and the proposition. And they should build on one another. So ideally, I love a name that perhaps gives some of its secrets, but not all of its secrets. We love that sense of intrigue. Wet your whistle. The strapline then adds a little bit more information. So the reader thinks, yeah, I'm still vaguely interested. I'm getting a little bit more of a sense of where this is going. And then, wham, the proposition is the point at which you really bring in that information. Often, of course, we'll be working with organisations where a name change is simply not possible, or even they had commissioned us to explore whether it could be possible, and the researcher said no, in which case the name is the name, you have to use the other devices. But certainly we would challenge a client if by the end of that third level of the proposition, people still didn't know what was going on. I think strapline is an interesting one. I think straplines are quite seasonal. I think we've gone through periods where they've kind of fallen out of favour a little bit, and then they've resurged. I think that there tends to be two different types of strapline. I think there's the descriptive, it is there to tell you something, and then there's the kind of whimsical. It really tells you nothing, but it's a great thing to say. The only thing I usually push back is on when a client is suggesting strapline that I think is true of virtually all of their competitors, or even everybody. We'll see there's kind of universal. And frankly, if anybody could comfortably use that strapline, it is utterly pointless and should be removed.
I was going to say, in terms of updating key messages, how often do organisations really need to worry about that?
Well, I think you only need to update your key messaging when the organisation has fundamentally changed or in some way evolved so as to render the existing version of the messaging a little bit dated. So that could be a factual inaccuracy. So let's say your proposition talks about being active nationwide, and actually since that was written, you're now in 38 countries. Well, clearly you're going to want to update that. Sometimes it will be almost the nuance of positioning. It's not so much wrong, but when we wrote that 5 years ago, we were emphasising this, but actually today we would emphasise that. I would say typically clients are encouraged to tweak the messaging on their own. They don't need to come back to an agency to say that instead of 38 countries, they're now in 64 countries. However, if they were completely repositioning or re-expressing, that's the point at which we'd probably say, look, come back to us and we'll do a version 2, version 3. But I think if you've used the same messaging for 5, 6, 7 years, and frankly, you're still the same organisation, I wouldn't worry unduly about refreshing it. Because I think the temptation can be, we're bored of that now. And actually you're bored of it because you've been writing these messages for 7 years. But actually most people are working with entirely different audiences every year. So students are in a 3, 4, 5 year cycle. So actually if you're using it in year 6, that'll be the first time these cohort have ever seen it. Whereas we find people deviating from what we've given simply because they're bored of it and they want something new. And we would encourage them not to do that because, it's eminently possible for a person to go through 10, 20 years of being pretty much the same person, frankly. Because why would you massively change your personality and kind of core self if it's working for you just because you're bored? I mean, you might get a different coloured suit, but you're not going to fundamentally reinvent yourself, and nor should we encourage people to do that with their messaging.
And what about language? So mission, vision, values, elevator pitches, these are all labels that we hear a lot about. How important are they?
Well, not very, I would say. I mean, I think that agencies like ours have got a lot to answer to in terms of, I think, in our desire to professionalise brand marketing communications, we have productised to some degree these kind of things that we do. And the most common, as you said, vision, mission, values. I almost sometimes wonder if they've lost their meaning a little bit. We'll talk to clients and they're not terribly sure what the difference between a mission and a vision is, really. And almost they're documents that are forged in boardrooms once every 5 years, and nobody really knows them off by heart. They're not shaping the organisation. So we don't, unless invited to, we don't tend to start there. We'll sometimes do something we call beliefs, because actually if I said to you, Ollie, what's your vision, mission and values as a person? I don't know if you'd be able to trot that off. I'll ask you after the podcast. But if I say, what do you believe? You could hit me with all sorts of belief. We all believe things about politics, about faith, about values, etc. So that's a more accessible way in. But I think just as organisations need to differentiate themselves, agencies do as well, which is where sometimes they'll say, oh, you don't want this over here. You want our, patented something XYZ. It's an attempt for agencies to have some IP over a proprietary process. And I think that can be really confusing, frankly, because coming into it, I think most Marcoms people would know if they've got a messaging problem, but they wouldn't necessarily know which of the 40 services they're being pitched by an agency is the right one for them. And almost that confusion through language is the very thing we're advising clients to avoid. We shouldn't be introducing it, I don't think, as an agency partner.
And what about brand messages and identity? So broader identity, how do they fit together and complement one another?
Well, I can tell you that whenever we brief a project to our designers, the first question they will ask is, where's the messaging? So I think that they absolutely do impact one another. And I think that's because the messaging is not only the words, it's also the personality, isn't it? It's that first time, again, going back to the penny dropping, I get what this brand's all about. They're an XYZ brand. And that's great for writing the words, but that's also your pathway into identity. So if you've just had the revelation that this has to be a brand that uses humour, it should look the part. And I think that, we will constantly tweak the identity and the messaging throughout. One will constantly change and adapt. So yes, we might write the messaging first to give a kind of pathway to the identity, but then we will really come up with a breakthrough in the identity and go, we need to put some of that back into the messaging. I think if you were to have two entirely separate teams generating your identity and your messaging, any complementary features between the two would be purely coincidental, really. And I think that's true of, again, the metaphor of person. I think that you want to look the part, don't you? If you want to be taken seriously, yes, you've got your speech, but also you want to dress in a certain way that doesn't undermine the message and so on and so forth.
And you don't want those two to jar with one another. The last thing you want is for somebody to stand up a podium and then suddenly open their mouth and the audience just erupts in laughter because they just don't sound like the person who's standing in front of them.
Absolutely right, yeah. And we've all just got a great sense of what kind of authentic and cohesive looks like. Difficult to put a finger on it, but you know it when it's not there, when something is out of place.
In terms of campaign messaging, where does that fit into the picture?
Yeah, so campaign messaging, I think, tends to be the most fun to write, I think. It's where you can be the most experimental and outrageous in terms of the articulation of the new personality. Because it's, by definition, if you're going out to the world with a campaign, you're ringing a bell and saying, I've got something to say, please take me seriously. And you need to capture attention very quickly. And therefore, you're able to turn your volume of your messaging up because it's not a captive audience. It's not a hyper-motivated audience. It's somebody, on their journey home. It's, somebody that is, again, just scrolling through on their social media. So I think we tend to always include sample campaign copy in our initial work, a messaging matrix. So the client may actually have no plans to do any campaigns in the next 2 to 3 years, but really you're saying, look, you can't have a robust messaging piece without stress testing this on campaign messaging. So I think that really it's the product of everything we've been talked about, but it's the most kind of fun and external facing. Because a lot of this, messaging will only be seen by small audiences, by MPs, by funders, by the media, whereas campaigns are where the eyes of the world, everybody is on it, have some fun with it. The only rule is, don't be invisible, don't be boring, So, yeah, I absolutely love the campaign part, and I think you do as well.
Yeah, not least because I think it's rare these days that organisations aren't involved in some sort of campaign work, even if that is only on social.
Yes.
Yep, so it's instantly usable often in social, where we all recognise just how critical it is to differentiate ourselves and to very, very quickly engage and connect with our audience. So it's always of use, I think, in a way that pre-social, pre-digital, it sometimes wasn't. It would sometimes just sit on a matrix and not be used for a little.
You're absolutely right. I think the only danger of that new world is that it's easy to not be as strategic as you perhaps would have been. So, 10, 20 years ago, if you were going for a big out-of-home traditional media campaign, you'd have thought about your core message because you were spending a considerable sum, whereas it's much easier to have a scattergun approach, this message on the Monday, this one on the Tuesday. So sometimes we will do some work into not just the words, but actually how, what's the marketing strategy here? How are we using social? What's the layered marketing so that the message I hear on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday is escalating my interest in what you're doing. And that can be a real art. It's almost the science of social media rather than just the kind of scattergun hope one of them works. But what it has allowed us to do is some wonderful A/B testing. If you push a paid social media campaign live for the first time ever, in real time, you can push out 3 similar but slightly different messages and see which ones people are relating to best. Because nothing beats that, the client has their expertise and we have our expertise, but actually sometimes people respond in a slightly different way than you're perhaps expecting, and to do testing on messaging is absolutely wonderful. And we could probably fill another podcast on messaging testing, which is something we take really seriously. Effectively, often we will repeat the process effectively that we've gone through in the immersion stage, but go back to some audiences and say, you told us this, we think on a page now we've articulated that, are we right? They will tell us, and then either it tells us that we were incredibly prescient and it's bang on, or we've got the language slightly wrong, or the priorities. They might say, yeah, you're right, that is of interest, but this one is far more interesting to us. And that can be really helpful as well.
So if I am a marketeer working for an organisation, I've been listening about messaging because it's an area of interest to me, but I'm frankly not entirely sure whether I've got a problem that's meaty enough to interest IE or that deserves a full messaging matrix. What are the triggers? What are the signs, if you like, that I need some help with messaging?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things I would say to somebody in that situation. I would say, first of all, do you think there's a problem? Let's say, again, it's a head of marketing. And often I think they will probably say yes. The fact that they've come on our radar probably suggests that they think they've got a problem. And I would just ask basic questions like, do you hear confusion from your audiences? And that might be in the formal research, but it might just be anecdotal. How often have you or your team answered the phone and people just have got the wrong end of the stick? They're spending all of their time responding to applications because people think they're X, but actually they're Y. That's a great indicator that something is wrong. And that something is something to do with the message. That's almost layer one. Often we will have almost instantly got the buy-in of our client, but actually it's them taking it to board of trustees, to executive, and getting a case to spend money on fixing it. And that's where I think we can be useful as an agency partner in, sometimes we'll do a brand audit, for instance, and we'll kind of say, look, I'd be telling the board, I know they're reticent to look at messaging, but have they noticed these kind of 3 things that they're doing? We've worked with organisations where sometimes we've gone into a pitch and actually shown them their proposition on the left and using almost the same words but just slightly strengthened, showing them what a difference good messaging can make. And as soon as they see it, I can see the problem now. So, but I think that certainly if you suspect that there might be a problem with messaging, I think you need to try and collect as much evidence of there being a problem as possible, because that problem's not going to go away. And frankly, if you have your messaging wrong, there is really no point in spending 6 figures on developing a new website and intranet project and just going and spending a huge sum on a big marketing campaign, because all of it will be for nothing because you've not got the basic messaging right. If people visit the new Spangly website and they still don't know what it's for, they won't use it. The same with the marketing. Everybody in the world could be aware of you, but if they are misinformed because of your own messaging, that's not going to do anything for you. So I hope that is interesting to anybody listening to this. What else would we say? Well, we would say that obviously, we tried to make this not too commercial a podcast, but we'd be silly not to say we're an agency that would love to take your call.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you want no commitment conversation. Another thing that we offer, we have a book available about non-profits, how, when and why to rebrand, which has a whole chapter on messaging. Again, drop us a line and we'll happily send that over to you. Or simply just send us an email, show us a few examples of your messaging, and we'll be happy to give you an off-the-cuff response as to whether we think you're doing a great job or whether it's worth a conversation. But hopefully that is of interest to at least one person out there.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Dave. That's been really helpful.
Thank you, Ollie.